Well, there's not much going on. As Senator Whitehouse knows, there's not much going on in our nation's capital these days. So we thought we'd introduce some excitement. And how better to do that than a roundtable that co-stars two of the champions of sustainable energy, renewable energy, and doing something about climate change and something constructive. And we have a couple other folks, at least one other person, Tony Pratt's going to join us. And he's working his way through traffic and through the rain. It should be here shortly. But Gob, we want to thank you and Jeffrey very much for joining Senator Whitehouse and myself. We have a vote that starts at 11, and we'll probably be able to stay here till about 11:15. And after we leave, my hope is that the three of you will take questions from the audience and just have a good conversation. But we're going to be having a series of infrastructure roundtables that I hope to co-host in some cases with Sheldon and other cases with other folks in our committee. But we're grateful to both of you for being here and welcome you warmly. The first roundtable on coastal infrastructure that Senator Whitehouse and I are hosting is a critical piece of the infrastructure puzzle. And I hope to use these conversations as a way of working through root causes, not the symptoms of problems, but root causes that are surrounding our infrastructure, confronting our infrastructure. Climate change, as you know, is dramatically impacting our infrastructure, which is already aging and in desperate need of investment. And building up on our resiliency along their coast helps to address the symptoms of climate change that our constituents are all too familiar with. I describe it sort of like walking and chewing gum. We need to be more resilient with the way we're defending our coasts. By the same token, we need to address root causes, and that's why we focus a whole lot on climate change. Nobody does it better than Sheldon. However, we can't lose sight of the fact that while resiliency projects are critical, they only address the symptoms. Actually, they don't address the symptoms. They would address the appeared symptoms. They do address the symptoms of the problem. But we need to go after the root causes. And as you know, our president's raised the issue of America needing to modernize and rebuild aged-out infrastructure as a point of concern. Democratic senators recently released a blueprint for addressing our infrastructure challenges. It's clear that the members on both sides of the aisle want to address this problem. I'm a recovering governor. Sheldon's a recovering attorney general. I'm not sure I'll ever fully recover, and I hope not. But I judge legislation, at least in part, by asking how does this proposal actually provide for a more nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation? Always focusing on that connection. How does it relate to creating a better environment for job creation and job preservation? And that's how I will evaluate infrastructure legislation, given the importance of infrastructure to a strong economy. Most of us heard of McKinsey. McKinsey has an institute called the Global Institute. In 2013, they put out a report, they call it Game Changers, which analyzes how the U.S. could dramatically transform and expand our economy. And one of the top changes was robust infrastructure investment writ large. And the report said if we didn't invest between $150 and $180 billion more, that's a lot of money, in infrastructure writ large, not just roads, highways, bridges, not just rail, not just ports, not just broadband, but all the above and more. But if we would do that, we would grow our economy. I think they said each year about 1.4 to 1.7%. There's about 1.5% GDP growth per year over the next decade. Create about 1.8 million new jobs by 2020. And in the same report, they found that one of the best ways to invest and to get most from our dollars is to maintain our existing infrastructure, which is why we should protect our coastlines. And here are some of the reasons why. I'll give you three reasons. 4 out of 5 Americans live within 60 miles of the coast. Think about that. 4 out of 5 Americans live within 60 miles of one of our coasts. About 4%
of Rhode Islanders, by the way.
100% of Delawareans.
Rhode Islanders.
And Delaware, there you go. About 2 out of 5 people in our population live directly on the coast. 2 out of 5. The coastal communities contribute almost $6.5 trillion. Coastal communities, $6.5 trillion to annual GDP of our country. And though state and local governments are primarily responsible for managing their coastlines, the federal government does play an important role in doing for the people what they cannot do for themselves. And that includes supporting efforts to protect, maintain coastal areas with programs that support habitat protection, address flooding, promote the beach renourishment, and coastal restoration. In many coastal areas, especially those that are densely populated. Coastal protection and risk reduction strategies relied on built infrastructure such as seawalls, such as levees, such as bulkheads. We've all seen those. However, a growing body of work has demonstrated that natural and nature-based infrastructure investments, which include things like tidal wetlands, marshes, mangroves, and beaches, reduce the need to constantly rebuild man-made infrastructures when storms hit, whether nor'easters or hurricanes or others. But the kinds of investments that I mentioned, wetlands, marshes, mangroves, beaches, are extremely important, especially in a little state like ours. And you can see a couple of pictures here. Some of you have been to Delaware. We have, last time I checked, more five-star beaches than any state in America. And we only have about 25 miles of beaches, but we're pretty good ones. And here's one of them right here. This is Bethany Beach, which is just south of Rehoboth Beach, our nation's summer capital. And the picture on the left is what it looked like before we worked on the infrastructure, the dunes and the beaches themselves, and to provide protection, not just for the beach, not just for a boardwalk, but for the tens of thousands of people who come to here every week of the summer, actually from spring through the fall. And also the infrastructure, it could be roads, highways, it could be water, wastewater treatment, all the businesses that are there. For the cost of building one modest-sized hotel, replacing one modest-sized hotel that could be lost in a nor'easter or a hurricane, we actually do, I think, on about a 5-year program, all the beach replenishment, the dune replenishment from one end of our beaches to the other, up and down the Delaware coast. Over here we have the boardwalk at Rehoboth Beach, and is that a before shot, John? That's a before shot, and we spent. Go ahead, and same shot, but that's what we do with actually harnessing nature and turning nature used loose to help protect our not just our boardwalks, but our whole community and everything that's part of it. Our tourist economy, one of the 3 top drivers of GDP in our state is tourism, and a big piece of it is right there in front of our eyes. But these pictures show how dune replenishment protects towns and communities along the Delaware coast. Infrastructure investments are critical for the economy, in part because of direct jobs we create in construction, restoration work, and displaced workers that we bring back into the workforce. And just as important, modern infrastructure helps people and business move more efficiently. As we listen to our panelists today, again, thank you for joining us. We're particularly interested in hearing your thoughts in 3 key areas. Number 1, the appropriateness of financing. I am concerned that while financing techniques are a tool that may be appropriate for some kinds of projects, financing will not solve all infrastructure needs, regardless of whether you are a rural or an urban state. Financing, we usually borrow money to pay for something. I'm one who believes that things worth having, they're worth paying for, and it doesn't just mean charging things on a credit card. Second area we need some help on is for broader investment strategy. And while traditional forms of infrastructure like roads and like ports are essential to our economy, I believe that more investment is needed to protect our natural infrastructure as well, such as our shorelines and our ecosystem restorations. And without these protections, risks to man-made infrastructure significantly increase, and in many cases it becomes unmanageable. And finally, we're interested in finding out how the federal government can be more efficient with our current funding streams and get the most out of every dollar of federal investment. Infrastructure is a shared responsibility between the federal government, all 50 states, local communities, and our panelists, we're hoping, can tell us some unique stories about how the federal government can help state and local governments with this shared burden. And maybe leverage some private sector monies as well. We also want to know how we can make sure that we are prioritizing the most critical investments and ensuring that we maintain the assets we have first before building new assets we can't afford to maintain. No one-size-fits-all to approach. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to solving this problem. I think we recognize that, but we got to work in a bipartisan fashion to really address these concerns, build consensus on a path forward for this shared state, federal, local government responsibility to strengthen our economies. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheldon and just say thank you for all your great leadership on these issues and many others, my friend.
Thank you, Tom. Let me first recognize Senator Carper, the ranking member on our Public Works Committee, for hosting this. I appreciate it very, very much, and for all your terrific work. I'm very, very proud to have 2 Rhode Islanders here today. Grover Fugate is really a remarkable individual in the world of coastal regulation. He has made extremely bold and creative use of the SAMP authority of the Coastal Zone Management Act with special area management plans that have expanded out into federal waters, that have got Rhode Island the first offshore wind anywhere in the country, and that are now working on the problem of our eroding beaches. He has also been an early warning of the inadequacy, in many cases, of the FEMA mapping and the disappointment that many Americans will discover when a big storm comes and it turns out the FEMA mapping had misled them about their risk. That has been a very, very important role for the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council and our University of Rhode Island. There's been a great relationship between URI and CRMC supporting both the SAMP work and the review of the FEMA mapping failures. And as I'll show in a moment, he's also put together, again with a lot of support from URI and others, visuals so that we can see what the coming attractions are from sea level rise for our ocean state. And I'll show one of those. I also want to welcome Jeff Deal. Jeff is the head of Rhode Island's Infrastructure Bank, which was an entity created by our very talented and hardworking governor, Gina Raimondo, to try to lift up the Rhode Island economy and take care of some of our overdue infrastructure needs. Within that, they've had a particular focus, which I appreciate very much, on green infrastructure, and Rhode Island being an ocean state, they're also looking very hard at what we can do to support our enormous coastal economy, $2.5 billion and 49,000 jobs, I want to say. So, you know, great work, Jeff, and it's terrific to have both of them here. I'll just run through a couple of quick slides, but as we're putting those up, I just want to say that the slide here of Delaware with the water washing underneath those piled up structures reminds me a lot of a slide that Grover shows of two establishments named Tara's and the Ocean Mist on the Matunic shore in Rhode Island. And he has the old pictures of enormous amounts of beach between the establishments and the ocean, with people, plenty of room to play volleyball, plenty of room for other people to lay out on towels, plenty of room for kids to run around, all of that. And from not too long ago, those are photos from the 90s. And then this is what it looks like now. They've had to put pilings to hold the buildings up because the sea is now under the buildings instead of having, you know, hundreds of feet of beach between the sea and the buildings. So that's a Delaware picture, but we see those sites in Rhode Island as well. The one point I'd like to make is that when we're dealing with climate change, we often overlook its effect on oceans. But virtually all of the heat from climate change that has been trapped in our atmosphere has been taken up by the oceans. 93% of it has been taken up by the oceans. We're looking at, and the international community through the Paris Agreement is working towards trying to keep the Earth from overheating by more than 2 degrees, and it probably should actually be about 1.5 degrees, not 2, as our target. If it weren't for the oceans, we'd be worried about 30 degrees, not 2 degrees. And we would be making our planet virtually uninhabitable, at least by what present expectations are. So thank goodness for the oceans, but we really, really do have to take care of them. The problem is that as that heat goes into the oceans, they expand. That's called the law of thermal expansion. I don't think even climate deniers deny that. And in addition, NOAA has just reported that both glaciers and sea ice are melting faster than expected, so the water flooding in off of land from melting ice has accelerated. So what I have here is an image of the upper bay of Narragansett Bay. At the top is Providence, and then you come down, and if you were to go west, you'd turn into Greenwich Bay, which is the little bay in the bottom left-hand corner of the chart in Warwick, Rhode Island, and above Greenwich Bay, and just to the right of it is Warwick Neck, which is a coastal part of Warwick that is a beautiful part and filled with wonderful homes and small businesses. And then if you go across the bay, you see Bristol, and above it, Warren. And on the other side of Bristol and Warren is Mount Hope Bay, and there's our border with Massachusetts. That's the existing satellite image of this part of Rhode Island, and this is the image that Grover has developed using storm tools. Everything that is blue is land now, and it's underwater when you get to 10 feet of sea level rise. And the latest CRMC predictions are, if we continue in our current do nothing and deny climate change mode, then these predictions of 10 feet of sea level rise in this century become things that we have to actively plan for. So as you see, there a separate set of slides I could show you of Providence, but Providence begins to flood and we risk losing our downtown business district. But if you go down to Greenwich Bay, you see that that Warwick Neck area at the end of Warwick that I told you about, that becomes Warwick Neck Island. Oh, really? It breaks off completely from the land as it floods. And on the other side of the bay, not only does Bristol get a new little tiny archipelago of islands, but Bristol and Warren become a new island. And you can continue on down the bay. Newport, the western part of Newport, becomes its own new island, separated from the mainland. And if you look between Warwick and Bristol and Warren, the community that is heavily blue just at the northern end of that pocket of the bay is called Barrington. And a lot of people in Barrington aren't aware of the risks. They're not really all that coastal. They're quite far up the bay. But because they're very far up the bay, the land slopes very, very gradually back from the shore. So when that flooding comes, an enormous amount of Barrington gets taken out. Look at how much there used to be livable and is now ocean. And what we don't see on this chart is that around those flooded areas are new areas that are either storm flood zones or velocity zones that may not be underwater, but they're uninsurable, they're unmortgageable, and they're unsellable. So the damage to landowners and property owners in Rhode Island is not just where it's flooded, but also in the larger envelope that surrounds that, where you can no longer either get insurance on your property, get a mortgage on your property, or sell it to a new buyer because it's in too much hazard and the insurance costs are too high. So we face, like Delaware, a real coastal predicament, and I'm delighted to have both Grover and Jeff here to talk about it. So we will have to leave it around a little bit after 11 because they've called a vote that we have to get off to, but I'll turn the microphones over to Grover, and again, my appreciations to our ranking member for organizing this important conversation.
Thank you. Senator Carper and Senator Whitehouse, I'd like to thank you today for inviting us here to present on a critical topic, I think, for our nation. I'm from the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council. We're the state's coastal zone management agency, but we're somewhat unique in the nation in that we're a direct permitting agency. That is, we have both upland and in-water jurisdiction. We issue the same permits as many of the municipalities, but we have a different staff. We have coastal engineers and ocean engineers. We have environmental scientists, and we're very focused on design standards and how the built environment reacts with our coastal environment. So it's a very important issue to us, but we also have capacity because we partner quite frequently with universities in our state, particularly the University of Rhode Island, in looking at advanced research on coastal issues, particularly as it deals with ocean engineering and those types of aspects to it. Our coast in Rhode Island and in many other areas of this nation, I would argue most of the coastline of this nation, is under threat. It's under threat, obviously, from coastal storms that we see, both hurricanes and nor'easters, but it's also, as we're seeing, and in our state, we're seeing a doubling of the sea level rise rate within the last decade that we've seen in previous years. In the last 90 years, we've had about 10 inches of sea level rise. We potentially could see, as you've seen from these charts, almost 10 feet. The magnitude of change of that is staggering. So it's a very important issue for our program, because we directly deal with permitting and trying to ensure the sustainability of those areas, particularly the built environment that we're looking at right now. Since 2011, we've been building the capacity within our organization and also working with the University of Rhode Island to look at not only what our current situation is and what the threats are, but projecting that into the future. We now have the highest resolution and the most advanced modeling capability of anywhere in the nation. No one surpasses this, not even the Army Corps in this regard. And you're going to see here in a second, there's actually a chart over there that depicts it. It's the one called CERI. It stands for Coastal Environmental Risk Index. But we have the ability to now model down to the individual structural level. So we can predict what a storm or sea level rise will do to that structure by structure. We also have the capability to go in, for instance, inside a sewage treatment plant, and piece of equipment by piece of equipment within that plant model what's going on. So for infrastructure on the coastline, we have the ability to go in and look at those issues. We can do this for storm events, we can do this for sea level rise, we can do it for combined events, so sea level with storms. We're building this out for the entire coast, and the reason I'm going into this amount of detail is that what we've essentially built is a crystal ball now. It's giving us the ability to forecast our future without having to actually experience it. And because of our unique construction-related perception that we have of coastal development, I think we have a very unique perspective in the nation in that regard. What we're seeing is that our coastline has a number of issues that we're going to have to deal with in the future. Sea level rise is obviously one of those, but storms, and then as they interact, accelerated erosion within the coastline itself. As you elevate sea level rise, combine it with storms, you will accelerate the erosion rate that most of us see along our coastline. So what I'd like to just bullet is some of the things that we've seen from our research, and what we're finding is that our built environment is under-designed for the threats it faces. This is principally for several reasons. One is it was designed and built at a time when our lack of understanding of the forces it would face was not that great, and therefore codes and other mechanisms by which we dictate how things get built were not up to a standard which will meet the test that they're going to have to in storm events. As we go into the future, that obviously will become worse, because as sea level rise increases, it allows the floodplain to go further in, and allows it to act higher on structures. So structures that may have survived in the past will not in the future. We have also started to look at wind, and in fact, I think I'll refer to these. This chart over here is actually a visualization of the work that we've done for the Musquamacut area. The color coding that you see for those buildings represents the percent damage that will be done from a 100-year event. The sandy-looking color area is where the surge is. The blue is where the water actually is. What you'll see is virtually every structure within the design area that we've been modeling is damaged. And it will be damaged to some degree, either through wind, surge, or waves, because our design standards and our codes are not up to the role that they should be in guiding this development. When we go into the future, those design standards are going to have to increase. So we have to build not for today's condition. If we're building today, we have to build for what we're going to see in the future. So we need to have the design tools to allow individuals to build for a future environment. There's another diagram over here which shows now the blue areas, the new sea level rise that you see. And what you'll see is many of those structures that were in the land area are now underwater. But in addition to that, some of these structures, because the heightened forces in those areas, are now taken out when they would have potentially survived. This is not only true for residential or commercial structures, but it is importantly more true for our infrastructure. We rely on, for instance, in the Port of Providence, a hurricane barrier that protects the major downtown area of Providence. Yes, we do. Yes. That hurricane barrier was built on our knowledge of the system in 1950. There are scenarios where that hurricane barrier gets overtopped now, and what happens when a rain event is coming down from the watershed, meets that hurricane barrier, there are pumps that are intended to pump that water outside the barrier over to the other side. The problem is when you get an overtopping event, it takes the electrical system down, pumps are no longer functional, and you now have a flooding event on the other side from precipitation, not so much the surge. None of the development built in behind that hurricane barrier is anticipating a flooding event, and hence will be taken out. This is just one example of what we're looking at. Our bridges, our roads, our sewage treatment plants, our water supplies, our utilities are all at threat, and we need to up the standard to which they're built and invest more in these areas. Some of the threats are obvious. Sea level rise, I think, is fairly obvious and well understood. Some of the threats that we will face in the future are not as obvious, and I'll just give you one example. As sea level rises, what happens is it puts the pressure in on the groundwater, the hydrostatic pressure, because fresh water floats. It will tend to rise in response to sea level rise. Studies in our area, for instance, for the Cape Cod area, show that the groundwater bulge rises at the same rate as sea level. There was a recent study done in New Hampshire, and for those of you who are familiar with Pease Air Force Base, it's quite a ways inland. A response of almost 7 feet in that area, that is groundwater rising, sea level rising 7 feet, then groundwater rising 7 feet, will flood Pease Air Force Base and make it a wetland. Yes. There was another study done by them recently to show that most of the roads in our country are not designed for the hydrostatic.
For the record, you're talking to a Navy pilot.
The road systems have not been built to withstand those hydrostatic forces from the groundwater bulge. So they will have their design life shortened. There will be areas that will be underwater that won't be visible from the coast, but be responding to groundwater itself. Road systems are one thing, but I would also say to you that our airport, Green Airport, has a direct hydrologic connection through the groundwater. And our airport will be threatened from sea level rise, even though it's many miles inland, because of the groundwater bulge and the forces that it will put on the runways. Not just our airport. We have Reagan Airport here. We have LaGuardia. We have Philly. Virtually every coastal airport in this nation will potentially see that problem happen to them. These are some things that have not even been thought about because we haven't yet to see them. But this is what we face in our future. So what we're trying to do at our level is build for the future. In our permitting program, we're now building a scenario-based system that will allow us to look at these, and our desire, obviously, is to build for a future condition, not to today's condition. And I think it's pretty obvious that given the situation that we're in right now, the only way we're going to get out of it is to build our way out of it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Senator Carper and Senator Whitehouse, thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this conversation about infrastructure investment. My name is Jeff Deal, and I'm the CEO of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. We're a centralized hub of infrastructure investment in Rhode Island, and we run what's called a leveraged model. So the limited capital that we're provided, whether it's through the EPA, other sources, we then partner that with private sector capital in the bond market to put more to work in our infrastructure today. And in fact, in our clean water and drinking water programs, we run a higher level of borrowing from the private sector, what I would call higher mobilization levels of private sector capital than any other state in the country. So we're doing a lot more with less, and we want to continue to do that. Stormwater and resiliency is our next strategic imperative. In fact, when the Infrastructure Bank was reconfigured, a Green Infrastructure Strategic Advisory Committee was set up, and out of that has created a working group in which we are trying to pull together many of the departments across state, many of the stakeholders, because one of our observations is that the efforts in this space are very fragmented. Department of Transportation is doing one thing, Department of Environmental Management is doing another, Department of Health is doing a third. And what we're trying to do is pull all those together and focusing, frankly, not just on water coming in, but also, as Grover said, water coming in, water going out, stormwater coming in Riverine. And we have a picture up here that I think was in both Grover's and mine that you saw earlier, which was the Warwick wastewater treatment facility underwater. And that was not a hurricane. It was a storm event, but it was also riverine flooding. And of course, as you can see in the color picture, it comes out a lot better than the black and white in your handouts. Not very pleasant looking, because you know what that slightly brown color is. We've worked with FEMA to finance the hardening of that asset, but of course, after the fact, and what Grover said, and senators as well, is we need to get out in front of this now. And that's part of what we're doing at the Infrastructure Bank, is creating a customer-centric model where we're out talking to the communities, because this is a local, a regional, a state, a super regional, and a federal issue. And we're looking to change the way that we look at infrastructure investment, and certainly infrastructure investment with regards to this space. I'll give you a good example. We're in the process right now of funding a sewer project in a small town that's on the bay called Wickford, a lovely little town. And we're working with certainly the Department of Environmental Management. The approach has been historically to view this as a environmental issue, that businesses right next to the bay need to replace septic systems and go onto a sewer line. Great little project. Unfortunately, I think we should have looked at it a different way. We've got two sources of financing, not funding, financing which has come from the Infrastructure Bank, and also a small grant from the Community Development Block Grant, because it's also servicing a low-income apartment complex. When we look at that, we think it should have been financed slightly differently. We have a program called the Sewer Tie-In Loan Fund that provides long-term, very low 1% interest to homeowners to tie into sewers. It was not contemplated when this plan was put together. So homeowners are not going to be as actively involved in this as they should have been. Why? Because it was too expensive from an assessment point of view. Our program could have spread that over a number of years and made it much more affordable for a majority of those homeowners. Wickford has a huge marina. They have a couple of restaurants, but no white table restaurants, because you can't on a septic system. So putting in a sewer provides that capacity, and also would create more foot traffic for their stores. We think that tax incentive financing should have also been part of that, to lower the cost, again, because what we think is combining all of these programs, as well as private sector capital, which we're doing through our financing, lowers the cost and provides greater incentive to get these things done today. We also view these issues as both opportunity and challenge. In this particular case, the challenge was septic systems and cesspools right next to the bay, issues with potential flooding in the future, but the opportunity is economic development through putting in some nicer restaurants and better stores and creating a nice little economic development project where people coming to the marina are going to spend more time and more money there, and the leveraging effects of that. So we think that, frankly, taking a comprehensive look at infrastructure as a strategic economic development tool, not just a basic service, and focusing on these spaces as well, both on the local level and the regional level, can create both those challenges and opportunities, and certainly is a situation that we need to address now. And I recognize that we've used a lot of time right now, and with that, I'll finish and answer any questions. Well, I think, yeah, you brought up a good point earlier. Many people confuse funding with finance. And I think there's a number of different models out there, but certainly we think that there's a very strong rationale for, certainly in some cases, outright grant funding, capital that can be leveraged at the local level, and certainly partnering with federal funds as well at that leverage level would make a lot of sense.
I would suggest to you, as I was saying in the presentation, that if you're going to spend money on infrastructure, you require that they do an analysis of what the future conditions are that infrastructure will face during its design life. If you don't do that, you're likely, particularly within the coastal areas, wasting your money because it will be under-designed for future conditions. And I think that would behoove all of us to do that. So.
There's a great friend of Tom Carper's for many years and of mine for fewer years who served with us in the Senate named Tom Harkin, who had a wonderful phrase, which was that a United States Senator is a constitutional impediment to the smooth and orderly functioning of staff. So the vote has been called, the clock is winding down, the senators will have to leave, but we will leave both of you with the smooth and orderly functioning of the staff who are here. I appreciate very much the presentations that you have made. They have been expert and instructive, and we have a lot to do to get this right, because whether simply by distraction from current events or because powerful political forces don't want to face up to the reality of climate change, we are not paying enough attention in this area, and you have called us to our duty in important ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senators.
The White House and I have been called to do our duty, and that is to vote on whether to proceed to the nomination of someone who's been nominated to be our trade representative for our country. And I'm going to be joining him out the door in just a minute, but we have about 5 minutes left before they close the door on the vote.
I'll ask them to hold it for you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for coming. This is not easy day. It's never an easy day to get in and out of D.C., and today especially challenging. So thank you for making the drive. Thank you for making the drive over. Tony wears a couple of hats, but one of the hats is that of senior member of the team at the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. I don't think we have Christoph Tuller here, do we? He's a member of our staff on Environment and Public Works Committee, and who used to be our secretary of the Department of Environmental, Natural Resources and Environmental Protection. But Tony has a very responsible job there within the department, and he's also an elected official, sort of. And he's the president of the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. And I always call him my president. And and we appreciate his service. And he's not on his first, are you on your second term?
Second term, yes.
Second term, yeah. And so we're honored that he's here. He's also a great photographer. And there's a lot of collections of his photographs all over our state and the Delmarva Peninsula.
As long as you're saying this, TonyPratt.com.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Tony's going to be discussing a wide range of water infrastructure related issues and why protecting our natural infrastructure can be as important as restoring our roads and bridges. We showed some large photographs, blown-up photographs of some of the work that you helped to lead to protect our shore communities, to protect our infrastructure. And with that, we apologize for leaving. They don't let us schedule the votes. And if they did, we certainly would not be scheduling one right now. But we welcome you when Tony Grover and Jeffrey Vardy delivered their messages, really good ones. And I would ask you just to go ahead and follow them. And then there's just going to be a good conversation with members of our audience, members of our staff. And we thank you more than you know for being here. This is hugely important, hugely important.
Well, let me just add, sir, I apologize for being so late. I came from the coast of Delaware today, which is normally about a 2.5 to 3 hour commute. It was 4 hours today, a little over 4 hours. This infrastructure stuff's got to get improved. That's all I can say. Well, I was following the Police Unity Tour bicycle ride from, you'll know this, from Lewis at the Nassau Bridge all the way up Route 1, out 16 to Route 113. I was behind them at 7 miles an hour for the first hour and 10 minutes of my drive today. So that's why I'm a little late. I apologize. Yes, it is.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, sir. So John, am I going to go up first? You're up. Okay. Let me just say I'm following up on some testimony about maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago or so in this same chamber. I am the president, as Senator Carper said, I'm the president of ASBPA, the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. I am also the administrator of Shoreline and Waterway Management for the state of Delaware, D-R-I. I was an elected official. I was deputy mayor of the town of Lewis for 6 years back in the 90s. So I've seen the coastal issue under many different sets of sunglasses, I guess, over the years. I'm going to make some brief remarks and sort of think about this in a national framework. If we took the effects of just naming a few storms, Hurricane Andrew in South Florida, Katrina in the Gulf, and especially Louisiana and Mississippi, Hurricane Ike in Texas, Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast, Iniki in Hawaii, and the El Nino events on the West Coast, which is the entire nation, other than the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes certainly has their problems as well. We are spending an inordinate amount of money on response and recovery in this country. We can predict that these things will occur. We can't say when. We don't know exactly the date. We don't know exactly where any given year there will be a hurricane landing somewhere in the United States, probably this year in all likelihood. We just can't say where it'll be. There will be further expenses. So we really have to look at the lessons learned from response recovery. I'm going to just isolate on Louisiana just for a second. After Katrina, there were some very valuable lessons learned. There's a tremendous amount of money that was input into the coastal Louisiana for mitigation purposes against future storms because of the lessons learned. And one of the lessons learned was that the outer Mississippi Delta itself, the Chandelier Islands, and the effects of dredging channels like what was called Mr. Go, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, those phenomena, the deterioration of the Chandelier Islands, the breakdown of a lot of the wetlands within the delta itself, and the opening up of direct conduits for floodwater was what exacerbated the problems within downtown New Orleans. And so we have manipulated the environment to a large degree. We need to think about how the natural frictional interface can still serve us. I was fortunate enough to serve on a committee many years ago on the H. John Hines Center. I've referred to this book several times. I think I referred to it when I was here a few weeks ago. It's entitled The Hidden Costs of Coastal Hazards. It's from the year 2000, was published, so 17 years ago. I want to just read one thing from that, and then I'll pass the microphone on to my colleagues. It says in here in the opening paragraphs in the executive summary, the costs currently reported, this is the year 2000, so this was worked on in 1998, 1999. Sorry, the microphone, I need to get closer here. In 1998, 1999, this report was published in 2000. 17 years ago, this observation was made. The costs currently reported are typically limited to insured and uninsured property losses and official disaster relief expenditures. Even these limited cost data are uneven in availability and consistency. In other words, we're not even getting good information about that when it comes to a post-storm scenario. A much broader understanding of the categories and range of coastal hazard costs are needed. These include not only the losses to the built environment, but also additional impacts such as uninsured business interruption costs, social and family disruptions and health costs, and costs of the damages to natural resources and ecosystem services. So I think we're going to have a lively discussion around that framework today, and I'm interested to hear what my colleagues have to say about that.
Well, actually, Tony, unfortunately, your colleagues were able to present right before you got here.
Sorry. Apologies for being late.
No, hey, we understand. So we're going to open this up for audience questions, and we have a microphone that we're going to pass around. I'll start because I have one question that I would like to ask all of the panelists. As you know, there's a huge backlog on various infrastructure needs across this country, whether it's roads, water systems that are dealing with lead. Add in a storm like Hurricane Sandy or Katrina and Rita, and the costs skyrocket. We've heard part of the conversation today was about trying to build design better into these methods, but there are a lot of things that we should be doing to head off these costs and really investing in the infrastructure up front to make sure that it's able to withstand these situations that we should be planning for and know are coming. Could each of you talk a little bit about that and sort of, in your opinion, what are the things the federal government needs to be doing to assist communities to better prepare and to be thinking about these things more in the long term, and as you know, so that we're not just doing it on the back end and constantly having to recover?
You want to jump in?
Okay. The work that we're doing is actually intended to help the municipalities. We did it for ourselves, but it was serving a dual purpose. The thing that we see, and I think it's important for municipalities to see, is that these storms that we see, such as Katrina, Rita, Ike, you name it, are not going to go away. Some of the science out there indicates that they may increase actually in their intensity. But the municipalities in our state, for instance, while we've had hurricanes, we haven't experienced a major one since 1954. So the municipalities often have short frameworks of reference, short-term memories, and don't understand what they potentially could face in a major event. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do. But our municipalities are not unique, I assure you. Up and down the East Coast, you'll find many of the smaller municipalities in particular don't have the resources to look at these issues and think in advance as to what's going to happen. If they haven't had a major hurricane in quite a while, again, like I said, they've probably forgotten what it's like and what they may face. As we start to see sea level rise, an increase in that, again, you're going to see a penetration of that floodplain going in further inland, and you're going to see it occur higher on structures. The senator was referring to an analysis we just did on our FEMA floodplain maps in our state. They made some critical mistakes in our state. They use a methodology in our area that's from the 1970s, doesn't reflect the current state of the art in modeling. And in addition, the inputs that they used in those models were about half of what they should have used. The models which they run are called WAFIS. They put a 4-meter ocean wave going into that model. That may sound like a lot, but our actual 100-year storm event waves are 8 meters in height. As a result of that and several other mistakes they made, they underestimated the flood events along our South Shore by 6 to 10 feet. That will take out homes and infrastructure along our coastline. So I think one of the other things that needs to be looked at is bringing the FEMA floodplain, and I realize this is under consideration now for the reauthorization of that act, but bringing that up to current standard, because people don't understand. They think they've got the best information, and they don't understand that they're building and putting themselves at risk by relying on that information, unfortunately. The other thing that I'll just point out is that FEMA uses something when they're setting the recurrence level for a 100-year storm. They use something in our area just a little above the mean. That means it's a coin toss whether you're in or out of the floodplain, according to their maps. We're seeing much more flood loss these days outside those floodplains than we ever saw before. There are quotes as high as you see within the literature, 25 to 30% of the losses are occurring outside the floodplain. We've heard as high as some as 40% outside the floodplain. Those people aren't buying flood insurance. As a result, they're completely exposed when it comes, because if they don't have a flood insurance, they don't have any insurance, period, for that event. Those are the types of things I think we need to be doing along our coastline and also inland areas to help them understand their risk and help them make wise investments.
Let me add to that. Let me play off that. I think that was very well stated and very much repeated from my experience with Delaware and other states around the country. I think that in my mind, one of the significant things that Grover said is that we are understanding the present and the future based upon the past. And from a physical data standpoint, that's okay, except that the future is probably changing. And if the future is changing, how do we get a hold of that change? I'm going to take it to another level, which is the disconnect between local governments, where I did serve for 6 years, and I work very closely with local governments. And the disconnect is that when it comes to something like a coastal disaster, those issues are not addressed and solved at a local level. Right. The very first pockets that get turned inside out are at the municipal and county level. Then the states turn their pockets inside out, and then it's up to the federal government to come and find out where to find the money to bail out. And so there's no imperative in the land use decision-making to go ahead. There's no consequence directly, and I say that with some caution. There certainly is consequence. Let me restate that. There is not sufficient consequence to land use decision-making that puts future homes in an imperiled situation when we are going to depend on another level of government to come to the aid and pay for that. So until we really address that disconnect, in other words, don't let the past actions of government interaction be the way we do it in the future. I think we have to change that paradigm as well.
I'll take a quick staff privilege also before passing the mic around, but a very quick question just for if we can run down the panel. I know today we have focused on Delaware and Rhode Island in particular, given our two hosts for the roundtable, but just quickly if we could go down, given your experience in your world of infrastructure and coastal modeling and looking forward to the changes we're expecting, is there any state out there that is immune to the concerns we talked about today?
Certainly, from my perspective, and maybe I have that hat from ASBPA, dealing with members from the Great Lakes, Hawaii. We cover every coastal state except for Alaska right now, and Alaska certainly has its problems. Now, every state has tremendous amount of risk. The uncertainty of risk is fairly standard across the country. When I look at the West Coast, particularly, we tend to be East Coast and Gulf Coast centric, and when we talk about Barrier Island and Barrier Island relief, the El Nino events and the tsunami risk on the West Coast is phenomenal, something that has not been very well addressed. I'm a geologist once upon a time, decades ago, and I have had some tours of the West Coast, particularly Oregon, and there is evidence on the shore of tsunami impacts from hundreds or thousands of years ago, prehistoric, pre-written history. Of impacts and sediment way up into the upland that has shown where water has gone in the past. And that's not well understood what phenomena is going to bring that on. So the risk is universal, I think.
Yeah, I think the reason you didn't see a quick response is there's virtually no state without risk. Even the inland states, you're going to see, I think, increased flooding risk with the weather that's getting much more radical and unpredictable. So it's...
I served on just to add a note to that, I served on an advisory panel for FEMA a number of years ago looking at climate change impacts to the National Flood Insurance Program. And it's not just coastal, it's riverine. Riverine is a big draw in this country for most of the flood impacts. And it's trying to get a handle on the future precipitation patterns, what's going to be drier, what's going to be wetter. Is it going to be clumpy? We're going to have 5 years of really dry versus 5 years of, look at California, the West Coast this year, years of drought and then phenomenal amounts of precipitation. Is that going to become more of the norm? How do we handle those kinds of extremes? And I think that's a critical thing to also consider going into the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, it's, coast is not just seacoast. It is lakes, it is rivers. The challenges are a little bit different, but certainly the impact is going to be the same, and we've got to focus on all of these and come up with different types of solutions depending on where they're at. And we see a lot of that in Rhode Island as well. It's not, as we've talked about our picture before, it's not just about what's coming in from the sea. It's also what's coming in down the rivers and the riverine flooding and the rain.
Time for a couple questions.
Hi there, it's Mike Dersko from Senator Markey's office. I wanted to bring Jeff in on the conversation that Grover and Tony were talking about, which is that there are really two ways to respond to climate threats. One is to harden against them, one is to retreat. And I was thinking about the question, how you approach that question. I was wondering how you approach that question, Jeff, when you have a potential investment, a potential loan to make to, say, a wastewater facility or a community. What thinking process do you go through to decide whether to extend that financing or whether this is really a situation where that town, that municipality is at such serious risk that you're not going to have that loan paid off? How do you think about it from an investment analysis standpoint?
No, that's a good question. In fact, I moved up to Rhode Island about a year ago. Actually, I did. My family moved up not that long ago. One of the first people I met was Grover, and so we bought a house in East Greenwich, not over in Barrington. So, but all kidding aside, I mean, I think that's a very good part, and that's a lot of what we're focusing on right now with regards to assets where we are already at risk, is how can we continue to work with them to harden those assets and ensure that going forward, we've reduced the risk both the community and to, obviously, to the infrastructure bank, the community, of course, being first. One of the challenges we also find in this space is, again, something that was referred to earlier, is oftentimes everybody approaches this from a local level. You know, we certainly have 3 wastewater treatment facilities on the western side of the bay that all have their issues, one of which was Warwick, which we've, you know, hardened. Have we done that? Has it been done sufficiently looking far down in the future? That's uncertain. The reality is that probably makes a lot more sense for two of those communities, Warwick, West Warwick, and Cranston, to look at maybe we should pump all this stuff to Cranston's and expand the size of that plant. Why? Because it's sufficiently high above, you know, the models from a flooding perspective that in the long run it's probably cheaper to do that. But how do you overcome that, you know, local desire to have the assets, to own the assets, to not transfer costs from one community to the other? And that's, I think, a lot of the issues that we're going to be facing with that we've talked, all 3 of us have talked about. This is not just a local issue. People may think it is, but it really is statewide and super regional and federal as well, as to how do we really take a look at some of these things and think, how do we reduce risk by effectively sharing that risk? And some communities think they're at less risk, but they really aren't. As we've talked about, I guess pocket emptying was the phrase, but certainly that's one of the things that we're taking a look at.
Hi, Diane Hoskins with Pew. One of the important distinctions that was raised was the issue between funding and finance. And in thinking about how do we ensure natural and nature-based infrastructure projects are included as a part of a package, in particular projects like wetland restoration for all of the multiple benefits for habitat, wildlife, flood risk reduction. Do you have any thoughts about how do we ensure that a financing approach in particular doesn't leave natural and nature-based approaches off the table? Thanks.
Well, I think, Tony, I think you had a picture somewhere that talked about all of the different solutions. I mean, that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the Infrastructure Bank, is bring a number of different stakeholders together. And as Senator Carper said, there's no one-size-fit-all strategy. Certainly, we've got the Narragansett Bay Commission that is looking at stormwater abatement in a major way, but we don't think that's the only solution. We do think there's a number of other solutions that can reduce certainly stormwater before it even gets to wastewater treatment facilities, so green infrastructure, and we're looking to continue to coordinate a lot of that and make sure that we're driving finance into those areas. And of course, as you raise a good point, funding is different than finance, and how do you fund those? Certainly, some of those solutions are stormwater utilities. We've seen, you know, certainly some of those. We're close to having the first one in Rhode Island, and we're engaging with them around, again, rethinking also how do they make those investments. And I think Senator Carper talked about appropriateness for financing. And a lot of what we see is some communities would say, okay, well, we've got the cash flow coming in from fees, whether it's sewer fees or whether it's stormwater fees, and we're going to pay for these investments over time, and, you know, we're going to make these investments as the cash comes in. But of course, that wait-and-see attitude is also dangerous. So we view our role as also an accelerator. So it's not just about finance, it's about acceleration of an investment, saying, okay, you've got the source of funding, it's not coming in for a while, let's make that investment today rather than holding off until you've got the money in the bank. And how do we trade that off from an affordability point of view?
Let me add a thought to that, if I could. I liked everything Jeff said. To add that, at my world in Delaware and in my capacity there, I work with the Corps of Engineers quite a bit, and so it's the federal investment for actual mitigation, flood risk management reduction. And so when the equation is made of benefit cost and the benefit cost analysis, the cost factor is considered down to the absolute penny. We know every penny of costs. We don't know every penny of benefits, and I think that the conversation within government and also externally is not very well informed. When we talk about natural and nature-based features, when we talk about wetlands enhancement projects, there are a multitude of benefits that come from that that are never put into the equation through a series of processes, the Corps is restricted, as one example, the Corps is restricted to looking at only infrastructure of cost avoidance. When we talk about putting an additional wetland in or diverting material from a dredging project to a wetland or a beach instead of just putting it as an offshore disposal, which is the least cost option, those things fall out because the flood risk program is not really being tied into the operations program that funds those. There's some stovepiping that goes on, but I think we need to have a more thorough analysis of the full benefits. A fisherman in Rhode Island is probably benefiting from a good estuary, and a good estuary is based on a good wetland system. How is that equation really spelled out?
Sorry, Gary, I want to say one more thing kind of going on with that. I think one of the things that we also see, and this gets back to the risk question, is also about maintenance. One of the things we find is, even especially in green infrastructure, is that people haven't incorporated the cost of maintenance over time into that equation. And what we've seen, you know, whether it's putting in green infrastructure and permeable surfaces in a town beach, if they don't maintain it, it doesn't work. And so, you know, it's kind of investment wasted to a great degree. So that's one of the things we're also taking a look at, is how do we incorporate that need to put in maintenance on a long-term basis so that people are fully aware of what they're really trying to do and get through that investment.
I was going to say, as a direct permitting agency, when we tend to look at projects, we obviously have a lot of leverage associated with those, and we put all options on the table when we're looking at that. I think one of the things that natural-based systems have suffered from, particularly when we're dealing with trying to protect things like infrastructure, is as you get into the higher value assets, the grayer the solution seems to be at times. And they are often put off as a secondary consideration many times. We're trying to change that now through our regulatory program, and I think regulatory programs can offer an incentive to do that by providing easier and quicker routes for green infrastructure versus gray. And that's one of the things we're trying to encourage within our program, is to provide very quick out-the-door options for people and have design standards for those so that they will function and work as well as many of the gray choices that are out there, and provide a very easy path for them to get through that. I think that's key and part of that.
I think we have time for one more question real quick. Over there.
Hey guys, my name is Josh Perlman. I'm from Senator Schumer's office. So what struck me was Mr. Fugate's Providence, Rhode Island example that we talked about a couple of minutes ago, and it just illuminated how outdated a lot of our coastal infrastructure technology was to me, not only in the mechanism which it operates, but what's behind that barrier, how that's not prepared for what's to come. So, you know, I think it's pretty evident at this point that we all know that the effects of climate change are dangerous to a lot of our coastal infrastructure, and especially the lives of the people that live on our coastlines or near our coastlines. So what I want to know is how we can alter or modify our current infrastructure, and or what new infrastructure we can build to combat these effects, you know, using the most advanced technologies that we have and the most up-to-date scientific evidence, you know, that we have. And this kind of answered a little bit of that question, but I was just wondering if anybody else had some thoughts on that.
I think as we go into the future, particularly mid-century and beyond, we're going to have to break out of our way that we typically think about things, and can't rely on the old standard way that we used to do things. The Port of Providence, that hurricane barrier, protects from storms, but it doesn't protect from sea level rise. About 3 feet of sea level rise, which we could expect potentially by the mid-century, will overtake most of the defenses that are in the center part of Providence and allow twice daily flooding of that area throughout the city. We're going to need to think about how we deal with that threat, the tidal threat, as well as the storm surge threat, so that as we design and build, it's being built for multiple purposes. And as I said, I think the key thing is to consider those future conditions of which it's going to face and make sure that we're building for those future conditions. I can't tell you how many meetings I walk into with government agencies, agency after agency, And the standard thought process is status quo today. And nobody thinks about what's tomorrow going to bring and what do we need to think about for tomorrow and how do we build for tomorrow. As I said, I think from our perspective, we've got a bad situation, and the only way we're going to get out of this is to build our way out of it at this point.
I think the other thing too, Grover, you talked about this earlier, is taking a look at a comprehensive approach. So the hurricane barrier is great if you're focused on what's on the other side, but it's what's behind as well. In Providence also, as water continues to flow in, as silt continues to come down the rivers going into that port and into the area behind the hurricane barrier, that makes it even more difficult because the water is already higher behind the barrier, not just on the other side. And so just thinking about what happens in the bay coming up is short-sighted, because we really have to take a look at what comprehensively, what's the issue facing an area like Providence that's both coming down the rivers, groundwater, and what's happening from in the bay.
I think the other thing I'd add to that is that we need to think about how we can incentivize change behavior at a community level, county level. We see some examples of what can be done to guard against the future, but there's little incentive for people to do that, especially when they're taking a risk assessment every day. We all take a risk assessment. It's what we choose to get in a car and drive over here. It's a risk I've taken. Getting up in the morning and saying, I'm not going to have a storm this year, a risk the coastal community is probably taking. So we're looking at how we can partner better. The data, the information is usually held at a much higher level of government at the federal and state levels. It is not taken advantage of necessarily, but there should be a way. I think the NFIP, in a large degree, is, with all its bumps and bruises, is probably a good example of a carrot and stick program, that if you want something at the end, like a higher level of storm response, you're doing things proactively before you get there. And I think we have to rethink the way we do business.
And so risk is also not properly put in the marketplace as well. You know, mortgage bankers are still lending at the same rate to homes, and as we saw in Barrington, as they are on the other side, you know, further up from the water. Insurance companies are starting to take a look at this more. I know Grover's been working a lot on that, but a lot of these places, the risk has not been properly priced in, and that's creating a disincentive for action.
I think Tony made a very good point early on that gets at this issue. We're willing to spend on the backside of a storm. We're willing to go in, particularly at the federal level, after a storm and spend to try to put things back. We're not willing to go in front of that and spend to actually prevent the damage. And I think that's where we need to rethink our approaches.
And to put a fine point on that, we know better. We really do.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists today, because this was a very informative, and actually, Grover, Tony, and Jeff, I think you brought it together at the very end with the question that we're all asking ourselves is, how do we really work to do this paradigm shift that you've all been talking about in various angles of how do we address it up front rather than address it behind the storm? And how do we really try to make infrastructure a priority long term? And I think that's going to have to be the next stage of these conversations as we're going forward. And again, thank you for participating on behalf of Senator Carper and Senator Whitehouse and everybody who worked on the panel today. We appreciate your help and your expertise. And I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions that we'll be providing to you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.